The aftermath of the great battle felt unreal to many who had survived the siege. The smoky skies over Riverrun, still tinged with red from the lingering fires, seemed an omen of both deliverance and the costs yet to be paid. In the courtyard, the wounded lay in rows awaiting the maester's care, their groans and ragged breathing a testament to the brutal struggle it had taken to break Tywin's encirclement. Officers barked orders at exhausted footmen, carting away shattered planks of the ruined siege equipment. More men trudged onto the field beyond the walls, searching for survivors amid the carnage, or dragging Lannister prisoners back behind stout iron bars. Ned Stark remained in the courtyard, unwilling to withdraw to the keep until he had personally thanked or consoled as many men as he could. He used a tall cane now. The crutch had been set aside in favor of something less cumbersome, though his limp was plain. He walked from cluster to cluster, pausing where northern soldiers stacked the dead in grim layers. Occasionally, he asked a name or turned a face to see if it was someone he knew. Each time he found an old friend or a loyal retainer among the fallen. A stabbing pain twisted in his chest sharper than his legs' ache. Some men noticed, bowing stiffly and urging him to rest, but he only shook his head. Eddard Stark would not leave these tasks to lesser officers. These were his men, and he loved them as he might love his own kin. In the chaos, Lady Catelyn approached, escorted by 2 Tully guards who were half-limping themselves. She placed a hand on Ned's arm, quiet tears in her eyes. The sky overhead was an ashen hue, and gusts of wind sent ash swirling. They stood together for a moment, gazing at the rows of bodies, the living and the dead. More men were hauling corpses over wagons to bury them. The entire courtyard stank of blood and smoke, but also of something faintly hopeful, the sense that they had at last slipped free of Tywin's chokehold. "Come inside soon," Catelyn whispered to her husband. "You need rest, Ned. We've won a battle, but there may be more to come. You cannot fight if you collapse." He glanced at her pale face. The lines of worry there seemed deeper than he remembered. "A few more minutes," he said quietly. "I must see how many of our wounded still need care. After that, I promise I'll come." She nodded, brushing away a tear. Her voice was thin from weeping. Joy for the victory, sorrow for the cost. "I'll wait for you in the great hall then." Ned watched her go, leaning on the cane to walk further along. He recognized Roderick Castle's figure assisting a group of men who hammered makeshift stretchers together for the injured. Nearby, the great Jon stood tall, bellowing orders that the battlefield beyond the walls be scoured for any Lannisters hiding in the gullies by the river. Once Ned had spoken a few solemn words to the men, and said quiet prayers over 3 of his household guard who had fallen. He made his way indoors to keep his promise. He passed under the tall archway of Riverrun's main keep, where the banners of House Tully still hung. Inside the great hall, candelabras lit the wide space. Smoke had drifted in through the high windows, leaving the air hazy, but it was warmer than outside. Servants with anxious faces shuffled about, carrying trays of simple fare, brown bread, boiled carrots, weak ale. All they could spare for the moment, given how supplies were worn thin by the siege. Robb was there, near the dais, in conference with Brynden Tully and Lord Roose Bolton, who had finally entered the castle grounds once the battle ended. The men were coated in grime, their armor scratched and streaked with blood. Roose Bolton in particular was an unsettling sight. Though slight of build, he had a calmness about him that belied the ferocity his men had shown on the field. He was quietly reporting the last sightings of Tywin Lannister. "Headed south, from what our scouts say," Bolton was explaining as Ned approached. "With a remnant of no more than 300 or 400 riders. Their foot is shattered. If he reaches the Blackwater, he might regroup with forces in King's Landing, but it will take him time." Robb's hair was damp with sweat and caked mud. He glanced at Ned and stood straighter. "Father," he said, a tremor in his voice that betrayed both exhaustion and relief. "We were just discussing our next move. Lord Bolton's men have the outer roads secured for now. Tywin has fled. The siege is lifted. We have Riverrun back in our hands, and the Riverlands are free of Lannister occupation, for the moment." Ned inclined his head to Bolton and Brynden. "You arrived when we needed you most," he said to Bolton. "How did you gather so many men?" Bolton dipped his head in an almost courtly gesture. "Word of Lord Stark's captivity and the war spread. Many northern bannermen assembled at Moat Cailin once we knew King Robb." He paused as Robb bristled at the title, though a faint wry smile crossed the man's lips. "Pardon me, the young wolf, as they name him, had broken Jaime's forces. But we also learned from ravens that you were trapped here with Tywin sieging. Myself, Lord Serwyn, Lord Karstark, and more rallied. Even the Manderleys have sent a strong contingent. It took time to cross the neck. The roads were not friendly, and Lannister scouts threatened us. Yet we prevailed. Our numbers are greater than ever." Brynden Tully nodded. "The River Lords, emboldened by your victory over Jaime and now Tywin's flight, have begun calling their banners more freely. We can rally a large host if we march forth from Riverrun." Ned's gaze flickered to Robb, who pressed his lips together. "We can press on King's Landing," his son said, echoing the thought that all of them had likely considered. "We have the advantage. Tywin is on the run with only a fraction of his men." King's Landing might be forced to yield Sansa. Catelyn, who had been sitting on a bench with a cup of watered wine, rose and joined them. The fatigue in her expression lightened momentarily at the mention of pushing south. "If we appear at the capital's doorstep, threatening to lay siege ourselves, Cersei may see no choice but to release Sansa. She cannot hope to withstand the combined might of the North and the Riverlands, not with Tywin's army in tatters." Roose Bolton's pale eyes flicked from Catelyn to Ned. "But King's Landing is well fortified, and the city is large, with many potential reinforcements. There is also the possibility that the Tyrells might throw their weight behind the throne. We cannot discount them. It is a risk to march on the capital blindly." Robb inhaled, glancing at Ned. "We won't do it blindly. We'll gather the lords, plan thoroughly. If the realm sees that Tywin is beaten, maybe they turn on Joffrey. Some in the Crownlands might have no loyalty to a Lannister king. We could avoid a protracted siege, force negotiations." Brynden Tully tapped a knuckle on the dais. "We must also consider how many men we lost in retaking Riverrun. We should let the survivors recover, bury the fallen, and reorganize before marching again. And the small folk are in dire need of safety. Many have lost their homes. If we leave them unprotected, brigands or stray Lannister companies might terrorize the countryside." Catelyn's hand trembled on Ned's arm. "We can't let Sansa languish longer. The Queen might see our new strength and become desperate enough to do something monstrous. We must strike quickly or show a strong front to force them to the table." Ned felt the weight of all these arguments pressing on him. "We must do both," he said at length. "We see to the immediate needs of the Riverlands, rebuilding, caring for the small folk, and then make preparations to march south. Lord Bolton, I would ask your men to keep the roads behind us secure. If the Freys are still friendly, we can rely on the twins for passage. Once we are ready, we move, but no reckless haste." Robb's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. "If we wait too long, Sansa dies. If we move too fast, we risk losing half our army in an ill-prepared assault. Father, time is short. The next letter from King's Landing might say they've already taken her head. Or no letter at all." The mention of that possibility made Ned's heart lurch. He covered Robb's hand with his own. "I understand, son. I do. But we must gather enough force to ensure we can actually achieve her rescue. We cannot ride in like avenging knights and dash ourselves on the city walls. I cannot lose another child, Robb." A tense silence followed. Finally, Catelyn exhaled, hugging herself as though cold. "Ned is right. We prepare swiftly but carefully. We cannot be paralyzed. Let us do so as soon as is feasible. But let us not sabotage ourselves by rushing unready." Roose Bolton nodded. "We'll muster within a fortnight, perhaps less. My men are weary from travel and battle, but we'll sharpen our swords again soon enough." Brynden Tully turned away from the dais, stepping onto the main floor where a large table had been laid out with fresh maps. "I'll rally the River Lords who can march with us. The day after tomorrow, let's call them in for a war council. That should give us time to bury the dead, treat the wounded, and begin stockpiling for the campaign south. Ned's shoulders slumped. Yes, and we should draft a new letter to the Iron Throne. Make it known we stand with a vast host now, that Tywin is defeated. Demand Sansa's release or we march. At that, Robb gave a curt nod, pivoting away. He was caught between eagerness and dread, and it showed. As the conversation ended, Ned noticed how his son left the hall quickly, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Perhaps the memory of so many lost men weighed heavily on him. Ned let out a quiet sigh. When the gathering concluded, servants came to place a few simple dishes on the dais. Salted fish, a bit of dried venison, a kettle of thin broth. The siege had left them with limited fare, though the men had begun retrieving supplies from the Lannister camp outside. Catelyn coaxed Ned to sit and eat a little. As he did, glancing around, he saw more exhausted soldiers limping into the hall for rest. Some slumped by the hearth, half asleep. Arya appeared soon after, still dressed in muddied breeches. She hovered by Ned, her expression hopeful. "Is it true, father? Are we going to King's Landing? Will we get Sansa back now?" He stroked her hair. "If the gods are good, yes. We're making plans. In a fortnight, we march." Her mouth twisted. "A fortnight? That's so long. What if she dies tomorrow?" Pain flickered through him. He paused, mindful of the half-dozen men within earshot. He lowered his voice. "I know. I hate the wait too, Arya. But we must be wise. We can't rescue her if we're destroyed on the road. Joffrey's men still control the city gates. The gold cloaks might be loyal to him. We need an army large enough to make the queen think twice about harming your sister." Arya was silent for a moment, then nodded stiffly. "All right, I just hate it." She swallowed, eyes glimmering with an anger that never seemed to dim. "I'm going to train with the others now. Maybe they'll finally let me practice archery." He mustered a faint smile. "Don't run yourself ragged. You've earned rest." She rolled her eyes. "It's better than sitting around feeling helpless." With that, she scurried off, weaving through the throng of weary men. Ned let her go. There was a part of him that longed to keep Arya safe in a tower, far from war, but the truth was that none of them were safe anymore. At least in the yard with a sword in her hand, she felt some measure of purpose. Sighing, he returned to picking at his food, though the taste barely registered. Each bite might as well have been ash. Across the hall, he saw Jon speaking quietly with a pair of northern archers. Jon had streaks of soot on his cheeks, and the bandage on his flank was newly changed. Though half a year ago he'd seemed a boy with uncertain station, he now carried himself with a grim confidence. Ned felt a jolt of sorrow, recalling the vow that once he had recovered Sansa and all his children were safe, he might finally speak openly of Jon's true parentage. But that day was still far off, the war raging. Jon was safer if the realm believed him only a bastard. Safer, in theory, if no one suspected Targaryen blood flowed in his veins. He forced the thought aside when Catelyn touched his hand. "Come," she murmured. "You're going to rest now." He knew better than to argue with her in front of the men. So he rose, leaning on his cane, and allowed her to guide him toward the keep's inner stairs. His leg ached, but he could manage. A final glance over his shoulder showed him the great hall in all its battered state, full of soldiers but buoyed by the new sense of hope that had come with Tywin's defeat. In the days that followed, Riverrun thrummed with renewed life. Freed of the siege, supply wagons rolled in from the surrounding countryside, some from the frays at the Twins, others from sympathetic riverlords. Food, fodder, arrows, and raw materials poured into the castle. Surviving refugees who had fled the war trickled back, reuniting with loved ones among the battered houses by the rivers. Columns of Bolton's men scoured the roads, ensuring no Lannister stragglers lingered to prey upon the small folk. Spirits lifted further when Brynden Tully and the Great Jon returned from a short ride into the western outskirts. They arrived with new prisoners in tow, dozens of men who had deserted Tywin after the battle, including a minor Lannister officer who claimed to have knowledge of King's Landing's plans. Ned oversaw the interrogations personally. The officer, a lean man with a bandaged shoulder, insisted that King Joffrey was furious at the news of Tywin's defeat, and that Cersei might soon attempt a desperate measure to show her power. Ned gleaned no direct confirmation that Sansa was still alive, but the officer's words hinted that she had not been executed, if only because the Queen did not want to provoke the realm while Tywin's position was uncertain. Ned clung to that single precious scrap of hope. He prayed nightly to the old gods that Sansa would endure, that their next letter or next move might finally free her. Robb, meanwhile, spent hours each morning training with the men, refining cavalry tactics, drilling foot soldiers, and testing the new recruits who had come south. The young Stark had the bearing of a commander, though now and then Ned glimpsed the boyish grin that reminded him how young Robb truly was. In stolen moments, Robb confessed how the burden weighed on him. "I see them call me the young wolf, and I feel I must be as fearless as they believe. But sometimes, Father, I just want to be in Winterfell again, wrestling with Bran or practicing in the yard with you. I never asked for a war." Ned would grip Robb's shoulder, whispering that no one asked for war, but they had to see it through for Sansa's sake, and for all the innocents trampled by Lannister cruelty. That seemed to steel Robb's resolve anew. Jon assisted Robb often, leading small squads of archers in field drills. He'd become a calm presence among the men, serious but not aloof. Some archers called him Snow the Steady, noting how he never wavered in a fight. One afternoon, after a rigorous session, Jon stood by a trough in the courtyard, splashing water on his face. A broad-shouldered archer approached, clasping his arm. "We trust you, Jon," the man said. "You've led us well. If we march on King's Landing, we'll follow you anywhere." Jon, taken aback, only stammered a thanks before the man walked away. The realm might see Jon as Ned's bastard, but these soldiers recognized his worth. That moved him, though it also reminded him that he lived behind a shield of lies. If they knew his Targaryen heritage, how might they react? At last, the day of the War Council arrived. Lords from the Riverlands and the North had come to Riverrun. Lord Karstark, with the memory of his lost sons fueling his hatred of Lannisters. Lord Cerwyn, who had once served as a steward at Winterfell. Lady Manderly, the head of the Manderly household since the passing of her husband, flanked by White Harbor Knights. From the Riverlands came Lord Mallister and Lord Bracken, each bringing retinues. Even Lord Blackwood, feuding bitterly with House Bracken, had set aside differences to unite under Ned's banner. The hall was full to bursting, each banner lord accompanied by sworn swords, some wearing fresh bandages from recent battles. They all listened raptly for Eddard Stark's next move. Ned stood at the dais, leaning on his cane, with Robb at his right and Catelyn at his left. Brynden Tully hovered near, along with Roose Bolton. Jon and Arya were present too, albeit Arya was asked to stand behind a row of guards so she would not interrupt. The air smelled of wax, steel, and sweat. Outside, the rivers lapped at the castle's foundation as a mild breeze rattled the windows. Ned began quietly, addressing them about the cost of war so far, acknowledging the fallen, praising the courage that had driven the Lannisters away from Riverrun. Then his voice took on a firmer edge. "We have won a great victory, but the war is not done. The Queen still holds my daughter Sansa hostage in King's Landing. Ser Jaime Lannister remains our prisoner here, and though Tywin's host is scattered, we must assume he will regroup with what remains of the Crown's forces, or even seek new allies." He paused, sweeping his gaze across the gathered lords. "Our next move is to press the advantage. We will not remain idle and let Joffrey rule unchallenged while Sansa's life hangs by a thread. With your blessing, we shall march south, gather more loyal houses on the way, and demand the safe release of my daughter. If the throne refuses, we must be prepared to continue this war." Lord Karstark stood first, fists clenched at his sides. "I lost 2 sons to the Kingslayer and the Lannisters. My sword is yours. Let us avenge every Stark child they have wronged." Lord Mallister concurred, pointing a gauntlet hand at Ned. "The outrages committed by Lannister raiders upon my lands cannot be forgiven. If it means taking King's Landing by storm, we stand with you." Lady Manderly spoke more calmly. "Winter is coming, But my city stands ready to supply your host, Lord Stark, if you pass near White Harbor. We can sail men down the coast as well, if the Royal Navy does not block us. Lord Bracken and Lord Blackwood, bitter rivals, each made a vow to set aside feuds. They both voiced support for pressing on. Others joined in, some shouting readiness to bring down the Mad King's Get, referring to the Lannister-laden monarchy, ironically mixing up lines of Targaryen-era curses with the current feud. Ned found that more lords seemed to yearn for vengeance than had any interest in negotiation. The Lannisters had caused too much bloodshed. Robb listened, brow furrowed. Then he raised a hand for quiet. We do want vengeance for the harm done, but not at the expense of our own innocence. If King's Landing yields Sansa, halts all aggression, we might find a path without more slaughter. We must be open to that if it ends this war swiftly. Our men have bled enough. Some of the lords, fired with passion, grumbled. Lord Karstark snapped, "They'll never yield. The day Joffrey yields is the day a lion bows to a direwolf. But we will follow your command, my lord." He inclined his head reluctantly to Ned.